It's good to see you all. Welcome to the workshop on Bildung as counterculture. We got three speakers here. We got Garry from the UK, who has been teaching English for adults. We got Genie, who has researched into different kinds of adult learning and activism, and very much rooted in Paulo Freire. I'm not gonna get into more details about that. Genie can share that with us. And then I hope that we will have Uwe Gartenschläger with us also in order to share his experiences with Bildung in Laos, where he worked for a year or two some years ago. So the intention with this workshop and what I hope that we're going to hear about, I know that we're going to hear about, is how Bildung can change people's lives and how people, by changing their behavior, can also acquire Bildung, and that there are some empowering aspects of Bildung that is usually not addressed in education when we generally speak about it. I hope that we will have it'll be 8 to 10 minutes presentation from each of the presenters, and then we'll have time for discussions afterwards. I'll see how many we will be, and then we'll either stay in the same room or go out into breakout sessions. But I would like to hand over the floor to Garry. And please, Garry, introduce yourself and your experiences with Bildung, please.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I came last year to what I think was the first Bildung conference, knowing not a lot about Bildung. As an English person, most English people know nothing about Bildung at all. So I came along, really enjoyed it, and for the past year I've been learning even more. And I kind of made an assumption that everybody in Europe knows what it is, but I went to a conference about 2 weeks ago, and it was full of psychologists from all over Europe. And I gave my presentation. At the end, two people said, "Can you explain what Bildung is?" So yeah, so it's brilliant to have people from all over Europe here now and spreading the word. I'm going to present a PowerPoint. If somebody could just say they can actually see it when, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. Right, okay, Bildung, Biker and Beyond. The quote that I've got on the first slide was some reading that I did recently, which was about the Socialist Second International that existed before the First World War. And what really struck me about the quote was that it was about Bildung for the working classes, which is like my main area of interest, is that I think that Bildung should be for everybody. But what I recognise, having taught in schools, private schools and state schools in the UK and abroad, is that lots of the early Renaissance principles of Bildung, or Reformation idea of Bildung, kind of like still exists in our private schools. But what we get in our state schools is loads of preparation for employability, what I feel like is in factories a lot of the time. So I was like really pleased to see that quote, because it made me realise that what we're trying to do now, people have tried to do in the past. Right, so anyway, so if I tell you the story about where I feel like I developed my own Bildung, but I also provided teaching that I felt did the same for a group of working class women. And it was in this place. It's called the Biker Wall, which is a huge social housing development in Newcastle upon Tyne, where I live. And it's actually got quite a lot of civic pride, but it's a very working class area. And I would say that probably, I haven't got the exact percentage in front of me now, but it's considerably below national averages for the amount of people who have any kind of qualification at all. I think it's over 30% of people have no qualifications in anything. So it's not an area that really values education. Anyway, the problem was I was asked to teach there, and it was at a local community centre, and I had about a dozen. And the fact that they were women is neither here nor there, because it was just 12 women who turned up. And they'd all, in some way, shape or form, failed at school. They'd either become pregnant before they left school, or they'd just been kicked out of school. But it was almost like second chance education, because at some point in their schooling, they'd actually enjoyed learning English. So they all turned up, but the idea was that the qualifications that we have that are free in the UK and for people who are unemployed are all about developing their English for employability. So it is, you know, and most English tutors would agree with me, it's mostly kind of quite tedious activities around filling out application forms or writing letters of complaint to bank managers, which nobody does anymore. So there was a problem in that it's not what they wanted to do. So I started teaching them, and I was bored, and I knew that they were bored, and I thought, I can't do this because it's not actually what they need. So the action was that I stopped what I was doing, and I asked them what it was that they wanted to learn. You know, why were they there? Which is something that I would normally always do. But I was working for a new organisation, and I was trying to behave myself, like fit in with their expectations. So when I asked them what they wanted to do, what they wanted to do was write stories. They wanted to read poems. They wanted to read books. There was a whole range of activities that they really wanted to do. So I thought, to be honest, I thought that nobody knows what I'm doing here anyway. So I'm going to do what I think is the right thing to do. So we planned activities around what they wanted to do rather than what the state wanted them to do. I'm sorry, I'm not reading out any of these quotes at the minute, and there's a good chance that you'll have never seen any of them before. So if anybody does want the PowerPoint afterwards, but all of my my training in teaching says that you shouldn't read out what's on a PowerPoint. I do have references at the end. So anyway, we came up with some activities, and all of the activities were based around, the one thing that I do know in teaching English is that people write, it's a lot easier to write from your own experiences. So that's exactly what we did. And if I briefly tell you 3 bits of writing that we did that you might think are interesting. One was a time of trouble. So I simply got them to write about times that had been difficult in their lives. And oh boy, their lives had been difficult, but it was like a pin drop. It's complete silence in the room as they wrote. And they'd gone from wanting to go for a cigarette break about every 10 minutes and wanting to constantly talk to being immersed in their writing. And also the standard of their writing increased considerably because they were writing with what they felt was a real purpose. We also did a story called Lamb to the Slaughter, which is by Roald Dahl, which if anybody's never read this story before, it's about a woman who's got an abusive partner who's a police officer, and she murders him and feeds him to his colleagues, so that they are then complicit in the crime because they've actually eaten him. This story, I know that they took copies of these stories and shared this in the local community. They thought that it was so brilliant. But I think the most important thing about it was that we immediately had the concept of justice as a conversation point. And they were actually very divided on whether they think that the woman should have committed the act or not. But it was the fact that they were so immersed in what they were doing, and it was so relevant to them, and they were reading good literature. And we also did an activity called Agony Ants, where they solved other people's problems. So I think that you can see from those 3 activities that what it did is it caused a huge amount of connection and purpose to learn that was highly relevant to them. Things that came out of it, that they really bonded as a group, and they were actually a very diverse group of learners in age and culture. But almost every activity that we did was around values and their values and sharing their values. So we got to a point where as a group, we had almost created like a little society within that room each Thursday. And they became so much calmer as people from the learning experience. But I think the biggest thing was that I knew that when they walked through the door, their life expectations were really poor. And by the time 2 years, I mean, it was 2 years that I taught this group. So we were really connected by the end of the 2 years. By the end of the 2 years, one of them had gone off to start a university course. One of them had started working for a local charity. Some of them worked for the first time in their life. But the point is that they got to all of those things on their terms, on like our terms, rather than something that was just completely imposed upon them. So if I move on to my last slide, this is like my little statement, I suppose, that, you know, like my mission in the UK among millions of people who don't even know what the word building is that I think that we've got quite a divided society where people who are wealthy learn to play musical instruments and go to the theatre, and people who are working class and unemployed get courses to try and make them supposedly more employable. So I think that those opportunities that the wealthy get, everybody should get. So that, yeah, that's like my statement at the end. And I think that's 9 minutes. So I've kind of like split the 8.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you. We do not have a lot of sessions with police officers who get killed and eaten afterwards. So, but there's a first time for everything. Next speaker on the floor is Ginie Servant Miklos. So please, Genie.
Okay, thanks everyone. I was just discussing with Lena that it's been 5 years since I was involved in this Bildung project. And I took some detours and roundabouts in these past 5 years, which I think enabled me now to throw myself back into Bildung with a much better sense of where I'm going and what I'm trying to do. So I am a women's rights activist. In the time since we last saw each other, Lena, I built a charity with 25 volunteers that has 5 projects in 2 countries, India and Zimbabwe. We help over 100 young women access self-defense, martial arts, self-protection, and education. And I also am teaching a new field, Experimental Pedagogics, at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And I'm also a visiting professor in Experimental Pedagogics at TUMEN University in Russia. So actually, Experimental Pedagogics was pioneered at TUMEN University. So that was like, Russia was my testing ground for Experimental Pedagogics, which is not the first place you think of to try something this radical, but it worked beautifully. So that's a bit of background. Yeah, so my background is actually in education philosophy and education psychology, and I've been studying education for over 10 years now, studying and practicing, so in a kind of action research cycle. And I get very frustrated with the way that the Netherlands structures education research, because you have a choice when you want to apply for a grant or when you want to study education, you have a choice between education sciences or pedagogics. Education sciences is basically cognitive psychology, and pedagogics is basically instructional design. There's nothing about critical pedagogy. There's no way to study education philosophy. It's not even part of mainstream philosophy degrees. I teach at a liberal arts college, and we don't have, until I pioneered my course, we had no courses on education in the liberal arts college. And this in a country that has a reputation for education innovation, but it's all structured in this kind of scientific, quantitative, numerical education sciences framework. And I wanted to upend that and challenge the very premises of it. So I started a new approach to education that combined everything that I learned over the course of the last 12 years or so. So what is experimental pedagogics? It's education history, it's education philosophy, it's education psychology, education sciences, and instructional design, all wrapped into one. That sounds like quite a tall order. So how on earth do I manage to deliver this in a 12-week course in Russia and a 16-week course in the Netherlands? Here is how I do it. So this is kind of the matrix. We've got 3 tracks: project track, education track, reflection track, that run alongside each other from the start to the end of the program, whether it's in 12 weeks or 16 weeks. And then each track is structured in 5 levels: cognitive learning, individual learning, group learning, societal learning, and global learning. And all that together is experimental pedagogics. And we increase in complexity as we go through the program. So why did I choose these levels? Why didn't I just basically do Paulo Freire? Because all of this, all my interest in critical pedagogy started in my PhD when I wrote a chapter on Paulo Freire. And I've read a lot of critical pedagogy over the years, and I've practiced a lot of critical pedagogy. But one of the criticisms that I had of critical pedagogy is that it tends to start out with a focus on oppressive structures. So it starts out with capitalism is oppressive, patriarchy is oppressive. I don't know if you've read Bell Hooks, but Bell Hooks calls it white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy, and that's the problem, and that's what we have to solve. And I'm not saying she's wrong. I'm saying that I wanted to meet people where they were at, and people are more complex and they are not purely defined by the oppressive structures. So I wanted to tie my interest in cognitive psychology and existential phenomenology into a holistic experience of education. So we start out with what our brain does. So we look at efficient learning, effective learning, and enjoyable learning. And I work here with my colleague, Dr. Lisette Weinia, who's a cognitive psychology specialist. And we cover motivation theory, for instance. This is what you would call education sciences in the Netherlands. So we do about 2 weeks of this if we're in the long track, or 1 week if we're in the short track. Then we move to individual level. And here, this gets really complicated for students. So they're getting in their groove in the first week. Oh, this is nice, not too challenging. You know, yeah, we can do motivation theory, that works. And then I throw Simone de Beauvoir at them. And they're like, what? What is this? So we discuss mainly agency and purpose in learning when we look at existential phenomenology. And this is also a level at which, so in the reflection track, for instance, in the cognitive level, we do Kolb's reflection cycle, but then we do phenomenology at the second level. So they have to practice phenomenological interviewing as part of their reflection process. And all of these things, I'll show you in a second. I've structured learning experiences that are themselves experimental pedagogies to teach these levels. So at the group level, we cover group dynamics by Wilfred Bion, and we also do the drama triangle, the Cartman triangle. And then at the society level, that's kind of the chunky part of the program. We do critical pedagogy, but from really different angles. So you have the classical critical pedagogy, Freire and Knecht. So Knecht is the psychosocietal school. But with my colleague Julien Kroeg, we also teach Hannah Arendt's education philosophy around natality, and Bell Hooks with critical race theory. The Bell Hooks stuff, the Russian students really loved it. the critical race theory stuff, they couldn't get enough of it. At the global level, this is one that I added in the long track that wasn't in the short track, but we do education technology and environmental education. So we cover climate change, environmental collapse, technological overreach, and these kinds of problems. And we do that through the STS lens, those Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, those philosophers. Okay, one of the key features of experimental pedagogics is that you do experimental pedagogics, you learn experimental pedagogics by doing experimental pedagogics. So the 3 tracks are themselves really innovative in the way that they deliver the content. So the project track is based on the Roskilde model of problem-oriented project work. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a way of doing project work that is centered around real-life problems. And I'll show you in a second, this is what it looks like. So through 12 weeks in the Russian course and 16 weeks in the Dutch course, they go through this process. They make their own groups, and we have a really fun group making session. And bear in mind, because of the pandemic, I have only taught this course online. Everything 100% online. So they make their own groups, they narrow down an education problem, they look it up in the literature, then they come up with a research design for their own research topic, they carry out research, qualitative research, they come back, and then if they want, they can redesign a quantitative experiment or do further qualitative research. And then, and this is where this is different to just a research project, they have to design an education intervention that will actually be applied in a classroom. So to give you examples, I've got one group who is doing rewriting assessment policies at Erasmus University for autistic students. We've got one group who designed a sex education course for entry-level bachelor students to challenge the biological paradigm that dominates in the Netherlands. So they call it queering sex education. We've got one group that designed a program to use environmental education to integrate Romani children into Bulgarian education, because they were Bulgarian students in the group. So we have one group of students where there are Polish students, and they designed a program to challenge conservatism in Polish high schools. And we have one group that they set up a teacher training program for decolonizing history education in high schools in the Netherlands. And these are all year 2 bachelor students. In the education part, there are some lectures. So there are 5 lectures by 5 experts on the topics for each of the levels. And I do 2 of them, and then I have colleagues coming in for the others. And then these are the other pedagogies that we use throughout that track. So problem-based learning, the jigsaw method, case-based learning, writing the implosion, which is the pedagogy pioneered by Donna Haraway, and then something which I designed myself, which is Design the Future. And that's a workshop on reimagining education for a world at 2 to 3 degrees of global warming. It usually has a very transformative and profound impact. The first time I did this workshop, the students then occupied the university. So the dean was not too pleased with me, but oh well. And then my colleague Lorenzo Ducci and I really pioneered a completely new approach to reflection. And we've already had 2 faculties at the university who asked us to borrow the education track that we designed. So it's a combination of reflection diaries, intake interviews, and workshops that cover 4 levels of reflection, as opposed to the cognitive level, which is what is covered in most reflection options at universities. We do cognitive, phenomenological, relational, and societal level reflections. And then they have to write an articulated learning reflection, which is a methodology that was designed by Ashton Clayton for service learning. And to conclude, why do I see experimental pedagogics as counterculture? It's broad, it's interdisciplinary, and more importantly, it's emancipatory and engaged. The students are in this to change the world. That's why they join, and that's what we give them the tools to do that through education in this program. It's a counter movement to the neoliberalization of education in the Netherlands. In Russia, it's a counter to pretty much everything. and that's why the students really love it. It invites students to concretely engage in social change, because they have to design an education experiment, and they get a budget of €1,000 for each project group to implement it. And it challenges mainstream narratives about the future, because we take a realistic stand and say, realistically, by the time you're older, by the time you're 50 or 60, we will have reached 2 degrees of global warming, heading towards 3. So how do we actually deal with that, rather than wishful thinking about creating student pathways for a world that is basically the same as it is now, which it's not going to be. Yeah, so that's my team, and that's Experimental Pedagogics.
All right, thank you very much. So Uwe, are you here? And you should be able to share your slides now. And so please introduce yourself and your presentation as well. Thank you, Uwe.
Yes, so hello again. My name is Uwe Gartenschläger, very difficult second name for those who don't speak German. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Branch of the German Adult Education Association, as well as the President of the European Association for the Education of Adults. And if I may say so, our relationship with Nordic Bildung and Lene goes back to 2019, when Lene was a keynote speaker in the General Assembly of the EAA back there in Copenhagen, when it was still possible to meet. When Lene asked me to share an experience from my work, which relates to the idea of Bildung, I answered her that I can share something from my experience from my 4 years, 2015 to 2019, when I was a project manager in Laos. So this is quite out of Europe, but maybe it gives some food for thought, and maybe I won't waste too much time with the introduction. So the question Lene gave me, what happens when you encourage people to reflect on their own educational systems? So first of all, the starting point was that our Lao partners, which is mainly the Ministry of Education, Department of Non-Formal Education, and we decided that we would like to schedule a training of master training in non-formal education. Non-formal education is how they call in Southeast Asia mainly what we would call adult education or liberal education or Folkbildung. So the challenges we are facing is a lack of qualified teachers and trainers, and a lack of qualified managers and decision makers, because actually there is no system in Laos of training or upskilling on the topic of adult, or how they call it, non-formal education. As a consequence, there is a low number of trainings, low attendance, and which is what is really very sad, high dropout rates. Of course, the bad quality of the trainings and the bad quality of teachers is not the only reason for high dropout rates. There are policy priorities, and of course there is the how to say, I mean, there is the idea that people have to do a lot in their daily life to feed their families, to work on the rice fields and so on. So there is not too much time for education, unfortunately, especially for girls and women who are double and triple overloaded with work. So when we designed this, in an international team with 2 Lao trainers and several trainers from Australia, from India, from Japan, and from the Philippines. Here you can see all the names. So the initial idea was not to do a training for the Lao people, but with the Lao people. So even by training master trainers, we don't want to choose the usual approach that we come to a certain country or society to train them and to offer them what we used to know, but to develop the whole process together in a mixed Asia, European, Australian team. So the approach is to select 30 candidates that could apply for it from different spheres of education, not only non-formal, but also from university, from TVET sector, from NGOs, and yeah, the business sector, not really, to be honest. And then to offer them this training cycle. And the training cycle, as you can see, goes over 2.5 years. With what is marked here in blue is the training modules, the workshops themselves, normally 1 week. And you can see in red that we gave them what we call homework, or what you can do, you can also call piloting on the spot. Because I mean, the usual thing in capacity building in development cooperation is the challenge to implement what you used to offer or what you learn to the people. And in many, I'm now since nearly 30 years in development cooperation, and my experience is that normally we don't pay too much attention in accompanying the people during the whole process, our trainees. And not only give them, it's a bit naive to think we organize some kind of workshop, even it's a workshop cycle, and then we think they are able to implement it on the ground. We used a backbone. This is the Curriculum Global, which was an attempt developed by our institute and the German Institute for Adult Education to define a global curriculum for the reskilling and upskilling of adult educators with 5 core modules. You can read them there. I'm pretty short now to save some time, plus 2 elective modules. So how did we work? The international trainer team met at least 2 days before each training to fine-tune and plan each module. and we did the planning virtually in between the modules. The training itself was facilitated exclusively by the Lao trainers in Lao language. The international trainers were present as observers in the back and intervened when they would like to add something or give a comment. And we had mixed teams, international Lao, for the coaching exercises on the ground. What happened, or how is this related, how I think it is related to Bildung? You have this two-level partnership. I mean, the challenge is to work in a development context without overwhelming and at the same time being open for this learning journey to be a learning journey for all participating. So that's why we have these two levels of partnership in the trainer team and between the trainers and participants who had both the competency and were both asked to shape the learning agenda.
One thing that I was particularly intrigued about with your project was that you asked the participants to design their own education, and that you sort of turned around the process between the experts and the people in the program.
Yeah, I think that's something which I don't know too many sectors, but as I said, I work now 30 years in development cooperation, and I feel unfortunately that in our neoliberal decades we hopefully leave now. We very much have this technocratic approach that we know where to go, and then we define the way. And this is not how education or Bildung works. Bildung is an emancipatory process which should be open and should be a partnership. It is, I mean, for educators, it's always difficult because of course you are in a situation where you think, I would like to transfer knowledge, skills, competencies, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, you should be very careful that you don't overwhelm your counterparts and that you don't gain and it's not only an ethical question, it's also a question that you don't reach your objective this way, because on the paper you have taught something, but in the reality you haven't changed a lot.